Books of the Bible, books of the Bible, books of the Bible, let the true light shine.
7. Moses and the Red Sea Exodus chapter 13-15.
As soon as Pharaoh set them free, the Hebrew slaves set off in a hurry to leave Egypt. They took with them all their belonging plus the gold, silver, and gifts the Egyptians had given them. God did not lead them along the coastal road towards the lands where the Philistines lived. This might have led to a battle with tough Philistines, which God knew the freed slaves were not prepared for, and many might have fled back to Egypt. Instead, he led them into the desert by the Red Sea. During the day, God led them in a pillar of cloud that always stayed in front of them and never disappeared. All night long, God led them in a pillar of fire that lit up the route. Eventually, God led them to the shore of the Red Sea where they camped. Meanwhile, just as God has warned Moses, Pharaoh and the Egyptians changed their minds and wanted the Hebrews back as their slaves. Pharaoh got in his chariot and gathered all his troops and 600 chariots to chase after the escaping Hebrews. When the escaping people saw the troops approaching, they cried out in fear. "Have you brought us out into the desert to die?" they complained to Moses. "We'd rather be alive as slaves in Egypt than die in the desert." "Don't be afraid," replied Moses. "Stand firm and see how God is going to deliver you. The Lord is going to fight for us, and you will never see the Egyptians again. Tell the people to move forward towards the Red Sea," God told Moses. "Then hold your staff high and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide it so they can cross it on dry land." Moses obeyed. The freed slaves watched as the pillar of cloud that had been leading them moved between them and the chasing Egyptians. That night they were in light and the Egyptians were in darkness. God drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The people crossed through the sea with a wall of water either side of them. The Egyptians tried to chase after them, but God jammed the wheels of their chariots, and there was confusion among the troops. "God is fighting against us," they yelled. God then told Moses to raise his hands over the sea. At daybreak, the walls of waters collapsed, and the dry path disappeared. The whole army of Pharaoh was swept away. No one survived. Those safely on the shore knew God had delivered them as he had promised and put their trust in him. They also realized that Moses was God's servant and the best person to lead them. Moses and all those who had escaped sang a song about their rescue to thank God. Aaron's sister Miriam the prophet and the women took tambourines and led everyone in dancing to celebrate.
8. Food and water in the desert.
The pillar of cloud led the people from the Red Sea into the desert of Shur. They traveled for 3 days without finding any fresh water. Then, when they came to a place with water, it was bitter and undrinkable. The thirsty crowd grumbled angrily to Moses. "What are we going to drink?" Moses cried out to God for help. The Lord showed him a piece of wood and Moses threw it into the water. Immediately the water became fit to drink. "If you listen and obey God," Moses declared, "He will keep you from any diseases he brought on the Egyptians. He is the Lord who heals you." The people then traveled on through the desert to an oasis called Elim, where they found 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. Here they camped by the water and rested. They then set off from Elim towards Mount Sinai through the desert of Sin. In the desert they became very hungry and started grumbling to Moses and Aaron. "In Egypt we had plenty of food," they complained bitterly. "You have brought us out into the desert to die of starvation." The Lord told Moses, "I am going to rain down bread from heaven for 6 days each week. On the 6th day people should gather twice as much. On the 7th day there will be no bread from heaven, as it is a special day for them to rest." Moses and Aaron announced, God has heard your grumbling and is sending meat this evening and all the bread you need in the morning. Then you will know that He is the Lord who provides." "Who are we? You grumbling is not against us but God." Aaron told the crowd to come before God. As they looked toward the desert, they saw the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. The Lord promised Moses He was sending meat that evening and bread in the morning. That evening a large flock of birds called quail landed near the camp. The hungry people caught them and ate the delicious meat. The next morning there was a layer of dew on the ground which dried up and became like thin flakes of frost on the ground. "What is it?" they asked Moses. The Hebrew word for "what is it" is manna. "This is the bread from heaven God promised," Moses explained. "Everyone should gather as much as they need. Don't collect more than you need and store it overnight." Everyone started gathering the "what is it" manna. It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. Moses explained they were to gather just enough for 5 days. Only the 6th day they were to gather twice more than they needed, as there would be no manna on the 7th day. Most people obeyed God and gathered enough food for that day. Some, however, were greedy, disobeyed God, gathered more than they needed and stored it overnight. The next morning it was full of maggots and smelt horrible. On the 6th day most people gathered twice as much as God had told them. On the 7th day the extra manna was still fresh and they could eat it. Some, however, went out looking for manna, but there was none. "God has declared the 7th day as a special day of rest," warned Moses. "Everyone is to stay where they are and rest." The Israelites traveled on towards Mount Sinai. They were to eat manna every day for the 40 years they were wandering in the wilderness. When they camped at Rephidim, there was no water to drink. They complained and quarreled with Moses, demanding, "Give us water to drink." "Why do you quarrel with me?" Moses asked. "Why do you test God?" Moses cried out to God for help. "What am I to do with these people? They are ready to stone me." "Go out to the people and take the leaders, elders, with you to the rock at Horeb," God replied. "Carry your staff with you and strike the rock." The leaders followed Moses to the rock at Horeb and watched as he struck it with his staff. Water burst out of the rock, just as God had promised. Everyone drank the water. Moses called the place Massah and Meribah because people had doubted God by asking, "Is the Lord with us or not?" In Hebrew, Massah means testings and Meribah means quarreling. God had kept His promise and provided food and water in the desert.